The forest had no mercy left in it. Isolde had known this for 3 days, since the hunters had driven her from the inn at Ashen Vale, since they had taken her horse and left her the stars and her own breaking lungs to navigate by. The trees here were old and wrong, their branches interlaced above her like the fingers of drowning men, and the darkness beneath them was not the ordinary darkness of a moonless autumn night. It breezed, it pressed, it had shape. She ran anyway. Behind her, the torches. Always the torches. She could hear the men. 4 of them, she thought, perhaps 5, moving through the undergrowth with the practiced ease of those who had done this many times before and lost no sleep over it. They were not cruel men, she had heard them say. They were necessary men. The distinction did not comfort her. Her name was Isolde Vane, and she was 22 years old, and she had never done anything wrong in her life. She had kept her mother's house. She had read her mother's books, too many of them, her neighbors had said, but quietly, because the Vanes had always been quietly feared. She had inherited her mother's silver ring and her mother's silence and, it seemed, her mother's hunters. She did not know what she was. She only knew what they had told her before they had stopped explaining and started chasing, that her blood was old, that it remembered things blood had no business remembering, that it could not be allowed to continue. The trees broke. She stumbled out of them and stopped. The castle rose from the ridge above her like something the earth had pushed up in its sleep. Dark stone, black-windowed, 4 towers reaching into the low clouds, with the particular patience of things that had been standing long before anyone alive had been born. Iron gates, twice her height, stood open at the base of the path, not welcoming. Simply open, as a trap is open, as a mouth is open. She looked behind her. The torches moved between the trees, steady and unhurried. They knew she was slowing. They were letting her tire. She looked at the gates. Every sensible instinct she possessed told her that the forest was one kind of death and the castle was another. The hunters, at least, were human. Whatever lived beyond those gates was not. She walked forward. The path was cold cobblestone, worn smooth by centuries of feet, and her own footsteps sounded very small against it. The gates did not creak as she passed between them. Nothing moved. The grounds were immaculate. Dark grass, bare hedgerows shaped into geometric severity, a single dead fountain at the center of the courtyard. No servants. No lights in the windows. No sign that anything lived here at all. She had nearly convinced herself the castle was abandoned when the doors at the top of the stone steps opened. Not swung, not pushed from within, simply opened as though the building had decided to acknowledge her. The darkness beyond them was absolute. She stopped at the foot of the steps. Behind her, she could hear the hunters reaching the tree line and then nothing. The sound of them cut out completely, as though the air itself at the boundary of the grounds refused to carry noise forward. One of them shouted something. She could not make out the words. She climbed the steps. The interior of the castle was cold in a way that was not unpleasant, or rather, cold in a way her body did not know how to object to, as though warmth had simply never been part of the architecture's intention. High ceilings swallowed what little light entered behind her. Stone floors, dark wood. A staircase wide enough for a procession, ascending into absolute shadow. She turned. The doors had closed. She turned back. He was standing at the far end of the entrance hall. She did not know how she had missed him. He was not small, and the hall was not that dark, except that he had the quality of something that had always been there, something her eye had simply declined to register as a presence until it chose to be registered. He stood very still. He was dressed in black, without ornament, without affectation. His face was pale in the way that stone is pale, and his eyes, even at this distance, even in this dark, were a shade of silver that had no business belonging to anything living. He looked at her the way one looks at a problem one has encountered before, not surprised, not pleased, simply attending. "You have entered my domain," he said. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be anything else. Isolde's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt so that they would stop, and she lifted her chin and said with more steadiness than she felt, "There were men in the forest." "With torches?" "Yes," he said, "there were." A silence. "They didn't follow me in," she said. "No," he agreed. "They would not." She waited for him to tell her to leave. He did not. He watched her with that still silver attention, and the castle settled around them both in the way old buildings settle. A creak, a sigh, a sound like breathing from the walls themselves. "I don't know what you want from me," she said at last. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, not welcome. Something older and harder to name. "That," he said, "is not yet decided." He turned and walked toward the staircase, and after a moment, because the doors behind her were closed and the hunters were outside and she had, after all, come this far, she followed. He did not explain himself. This was the first thing Isolde understood about Valerian. Lord Valerian, she supposed, though no one had told her his name yet, and she had not asked, and the title sat in her mind like something she had inferred rather than been given. He walked ahead of her up the staircase with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed to account for his movements to another living soul, and she followed, and neither of them spoke. The upper corridor was lined with doors all closed and lit by sconces that held candles she had not seen anyone light. The flames were steady. There was no draught. The light was pale gold and cast long shadows and turned everything it touched into something from a painting, or a dream in which one is aware, distantly, that something is wrong with the proportions. He stopped at a door near the end of the corridor and opened it, stood aside. She looked at him. He looked at the room. She went in. It was larger than her room at the inn had been, larger than any room she had slept in since childhood, and it was furnished with the sparse, considered elegance of someone who understood that excess was merely noise. A bed with dark hangings, a fire already lit in the hearth, a table with a pitcher of water and a bowl, a window overlooking the courtyard and, beyond it, the forest, where she could just make out the distant orange smear of the hunters' torches moving along the tree line, back and forth as though they were pacing. "You're keeping me," she said, and turned. He was still in the doorway. "I am offering you a room," he said, "for the night." "And tomorrow night?" He did not answer immediately. His gaze moved past her to the window, to the torches beyond it, and something in his expression became briefly and entirely unreadable. Not blank, but layered, like a document with too many pages pressed close together. "We will discuss tomorrow when it arrives," he said. She wanted to push further. She was not, by nature, someone who accepted partial answers without discomfort. She had always read to the end of a thing, always needed to understand before she could rest. But there was something in the quality of his stillness that told her this was not a man who could be hurried. And she was tired, and the fire was warm, and the hunters were still on the other side of whatever invisible boundary kept them at bay. "What is your name?" she asked instead. A pause. "Valerian," he said. She nodded. "I'm Isolde." He said nothing to this, but his eyes moved to her face with a sharpness that was gone before she could be certain she'd seen it. A flicker of something that might have been recognition, or might have been something else entirely. Something older and less nameable. "There is food in the wardrobe," he said. "Cold, but edible. I do not keep a kitchen staff." He stepped back from the doorway. He did not say goodnight. "Lord Valerian," she said before he could close the door entirely. He stopped. "Why didn't they follow me through the gates?" The hunters. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might simply leave without answering. Then, "Because they have been here before," he said, "and they know what it costs." The door closed. She stood in the middle of the room and breathed and tried to organize what she knew into something coherent. She knew she was in a vampire's castle. She had enough of her mother's books in her to be certain of that, whatever she had told herself while running through the forest, whatever convenient uncertainties she had entertained about the silver eyes and the cold and the candles that lit themselves. She knew the hunters wanted her blood and that whatever was in her blood frightened them enough to burn down an inn to reach her. She knew she did not know why. She ate the bread and dried meat she found in the wardrobe. She sat by the fire and watched the hunters' torches pace, and eventually she slept, because her body demanded it regardless of her situation. She woke in the gray pre-dawn, disoriented, and it took her several seconds to remember where she was and why. She went to the window. The courtyard below was empty. The hunters' torches were gone from the tree line, the grounds were still. And Valerian was standing in the courtyard below, looking up at her window. He was not doing anything. He was simply standing there in the last of the dark, looking up at the window where she stood, as though he had been standing there for some time and saw no reason to stop. She did not move. Neither did he. Then the gray of dawn brightened, very slightly, and without haste he turned and walked back toward the castle's shadow, and was gone. She stood at the window for a long time after. She spent the first full day learning the shape of her captivity. It did not feel like captivity. This, Isolde decided, was either reassuring or the most troubling thing about it. That Vale Moor, with its cold corridors and its self-lighting candles and its absent lord, felt less like a prison and more like a place that had been waiting. The doors she tried opened. The rooms she entered were empty and ordered, undisturbed in the way of spaces that have not been used in a long time but have been maintained regardless, dusted and straightened by invisible hands that left no trace. She found the library on the second floor, behind a door that opened into something considerably larger than the exterior architecture suggested it should be able to contain. Shelves to the ceiling on 3 sides, a central table of dark wood, lamps that brightened when she entered and dimmed toward the far shelves in elegant gradation, as though light here had opinions about where it was most needed. She chose a book at random and sat at the table and tried to read. It was in a language she didn't know. She chose another. It was in a different language she didn't know. The third was in something approximating the common tongue, though the orthography was archaic enough to require concentration, and the subject matter, a detailed account of Coven law during the Second Interregnum, was not immediately illuminating. She had been sitting with it for perhaps an hour when she became aware that she was not alone. She looked up. Valerian stood in the doorway of the library, not in it. In the doorway, with the particular quality of someone who has been there for some time and has made a deliberate choice not to announce himself. He was looking at her, not the book. "Coven law," she said. "Is this relevant to my situation?" He moved into the room, unhurried. "It may become so." He crossed to the shelves on the far side and ran one hand along the spines with the ease of absolute familiarity. A man surveying not his collection, but his memory, she thought. Each book a thing he had chosen and read and kept for reasons that had nothing to do with decoration. "How old is this castle?" she asked. "Older than the kingdom that built the road to it," he said. She watched him. In the library's lamplight he was less opaque than he had seemed the night before. Not warmer, exactly, but more present, as though the presence of books created a context in which he was willing to occupy more of himself. "The hunters," she said. "They've been looking for me specifically. Not my family. Me." He did not turn. "Yes. Do you know why?" A pause. He selected a book, looked at its cover, returned it to the shelf. "I have a suspicion," he said. "I would like to hear it." "I know," he said. "Not yet." She pressed her lips together in return to her archaic text, though she retained almost nothing of it for the next several minutes. After a while, she heard him cross to the far end of the room, where the shelves gave way to a paneled wall she had not yet investigated, and she heard a sound. Not quite a door, not quite a drawer, and then silence. She looked up. The panel was closed. He was gone. She sat still for a moment, then rose and went to the far wall. There was no panel she could find. There was, however, a portrait she had not noticed before, hung between the last shelf and the fireplace in a gilded frame that had seen better centuries, half in shadow. She moved one of the lamps closer. The woman in the portrait was standing in a garden that no longer existed, wearing a dress from perhaps 300 years past, her dark hair pinned simply, her expression composed. Her posture was Isolde's posture. The slight angle of the shoulders, the stillness in the hands. Her face was Isolde's face. Not similar, not a resemblance. Her face, reproduced with the precision of someone who had looked at the subject for a very long time and wished to forget nothing. Written at the base of the frame, in a script she could just barely parse, was a name. Alara Vane, 1487. Isolde straightened slowly, She looked at the portrait for a long time. Then she turned and walked back to the table and sat down because her legs required it, and she sat with both hands flat on the table and the lamp burning steadily beside her, and she thought about what it meant to find her own face in a frame dated 300 years before her birth. She thought about it for a very long time. She found the object on the third morning before Valerian appeared. It was in the library. She had returned there, partly from habit, partly because the alternative was her room, and the room, comfortable as it was, had a quality of waiting that she found less restful than the books. The library at least gave her something to do with her hands. She had been reaching for a volume on the upper shelf, stretching on the tips of her toes, when the edge of her palm caught the object wedged sideways between the books, small, metallic, edged with decorative bladework she had not seen the danger in. The cut was shallow. She did not feel it immediately. She noticed the blood when it fell on the open page below her. A single drop, bright and startling against the yellowed paper. She lifted her hand and looked at the cut across the base of her thumb. Small. Already slowing. She pressed it against her skirt and reached for the object that had fallen to the floor. A small silver seal, ornate, clearly very old, with a crest she recognized from the Coven Law Book, a stylized set of antlers above a field of 3 stars. Then he was in the room. She had not heard him on the stairs. She had not heard the door. One moment she was alone. The next he was 3 feet from her and still, and his silver eyes were fixed on her hand with an intensity that made her step back without meaning to. It was an accident, she said immediately. He did not speak. His gaze moved from her hand to the silver seal on the table, and something shifted in his face. Not hunger, not the thing she had braced for. Something closer to grief. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the intensity had been controlled back to its usual measured register, but she had seen it, and she thought she was meant to see it. "Let me see your hand," he said. She extended it, because refusing seemed beside the point. He took her wrist in both hands. His hands were cool, absolutely dry, exerting the exact minimum of pressure necessary to hold her still, and looked at the cut with the focused attention of a physician, though she did not think it was medicine he was attending to. Then he stopped. He was very still. She watched his face. Something was happening behind his expression. She could not name it, could not track it, but it was visible the way heat lightning is visible, not directly, but as an illumination of the sky around it. His breathing did not change. He had no breathing she had been able to detect, but his hands, where they held her wrist, had tightened by the smallest degree. "What is it?" she asked. He released her. He stepped back with the deliberate, measured movement of someone exerting a choice. He looked at the seal on the table and not at her. "Your blood," he said, "carries a memory. I don't know what that means. It means that your bloodline made a covenant, once, with something old." He paused. "With me. And the memory of it is passed in the blood, generation to generation. I can perceive it. When I am near enough." She processed this. "That woman in the portrait," she said. "Elara Vane." He turned to look at her then. She had not expected that. The directness of it, the weight of 300 years compacted into an expression that was not grief and not longing, and was somehow both. "She was my ward," he said. "I promised to protect her line. Until the line ended," Isolde said. "Until the line ended," he agreed. "It hasn't ended." "No," he said quietly. "It has not." The fire in the hearth popped once, settling. She looked at the seal, still on the table. She looked at her hand, the cut already closing. "You should have told me immediately," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." He picked up the seal, studied it for a moment with an expression she could not read, and set it down again. "The hunters," she said. "They know what I am, what my blood is. They have known for some time, longer than you have, and they want to end the line." "Yes." The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her. His eyes, in the firelight, were not silver, but something closer to amber, and the grief she had seen when she'd cut herself was there again. Very controlled, very old. "Because as long as the line continues," he said, the covenant holds. And as long as the covenant holds. He stopped. You are bound to protect it, she said slowly. He said nothing. You are bound to protect me, she said. Still nothing. But he did not look away. She sat down in the nearest chair because her legs were asking her to. She pressed her healed hand flat against her knee and thought about a woman in a garden 300 years ago who had looked enough like her to have been her face in a mirror. And she thought about the word covenant, and she thought about the silver seal with its antlers and its 3 stars. You should have told me immediately, she said again quietly. I know, he said. I am sorry. She looked up. He looked for just a moment, just the edge of a moment, as though the apology had cost him something. He told her what he was willing to tell her, and she understood that there was more he was not telling her, and she accepted this the way one accepts a partial map. Aware of the blankness at its edges, aware that the blankness does not mean nothing is there. Alara Vane had come to him in winter, in 1487, fleeing something she had not been able to name clearly. A threat that moved through the church hierarchy of that decade, men who had learned enough of the old lore to be dangerous, not enough to be wise. She had arrived at Vale Moor with nothing but a silver ring and a bloodline and a desperation she had kept very quiet. He had taken her in because he recognized what her blood was, a remnant of an older covenant, made between his kind and certain mortal lines in the centuries when such arrangements had been law rather than aberration. The terms were simple. The Vane bloodline would carry, generation to generation, a kind of marker, not a curse, not exactly a blessing, a memory. His blood had been added to the covenant ritual, willingly. And the result was that each Vane woman who came of age would carry in her veins a faint resonance of the exchange. He would be able to find them, in extremity. He would be able to know them. In exchange, he protected the line. He had not expected the line to persist for 3 centuries. Did Alara, Isolde stopped, began again. What happened to her after? Valerian was standing at the library window. He had told most of this to the window rather than to her, and she had not pushed him to do otherwise. She lived out her natural life, he said. She married, had daughters. One of her granddaughters came to me as well, briefly, in some difficulty. The line has come and gone through Vale Moor 4 times in 300 years. A pause. Always women, always in trouble. Always the same hunters? The organization evolves, the mission does not. She turned this over. 4 times in 300 years meant the threat was not new, not circumstantial. It was sustained, institutional, patient. How many of them are there? She asked. Outside my gates at present, 7. He did not turn from the window. Their organization numbers considerably more, and they'll simply wait. They are waiting for you to leave, he said, or for me to allow them entry. The ward on the grounds is old. It is held for centuries. But it was not designed to be besieged for extended periods. She stood up. She crossed to the window, not beside him but a few feet to his left, and looked out at the dark grounds, the distant tree line, the place where she knew the hunters were stationed even though she could not see them now in the afternoon light. The seal I found, she said, the one I cut myself on. What was it? He was quiet for a moment. A coven seal, used to record the original covenant, a physical imprint of the agreement kept as proof of the exchange. And it was just sitting in your library between books. I moved it there, he said, approximately 200 years ago when I wished to forget it existed. She looked at him. He did not look at her. Did it work? She asked. No, he said. The afternoon settled around them, and the fire crackled, and somewhere in the upper reaches of the castle something shifted. Wood, or stone, or the accumulated weight of centuries finding a new resting place. I want to see the rest of it, Isolde said. Whatever the covenant contains, whatever you know about my bloodline that I don't. He turned from the window then, slowly, and looked at her with that particular, careful attention, evaluating not her request, but the person making it. The way one evaluates a door before opening it, attending not just to the handle but to what might be behind it. There is a way, he said. I would not recommend it. I'm not asking for your recommendation. A beat. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement. Not quite its opposite. Not nothing. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. From below, from somewhere in the lower castle, she heard a sound that was not wind and not stone, footsteps, careful and deliberate, in a part of the castle she had not yet explored. She looked at Valerian. He was already looking at the floor. What is that? She asked. His expression had changed entirely. The hunters, he said, are no longer at the tree line. He moved through the castle in a way she had not seen him move before, faster, quieter, less a man and more a quality of the dark itself, relocating rather than traversing. She followed at a pace she could manage, which was not his pace, and he seemed to account for this without slowing, without looking back, trusting her to keep up, or choosing not to know if she didn't. The hunters had not breached the interior. When Valerian returned from his inspection of the lower levels, he told her this with the controlled certainty of someone who knew every stone of every wall and could detect the precise signature of intrusion. But they had reached the outer ward's edge, which meant the boundary was thinning, which meant time had become specific and limited. They returned to the library. Isolde sat. He remained standing, but near the table now, and the quality of his nearness had changed. Less the considered distance of earlier days, more the instinctive proximity of a man whose protective instincts had been engaged. Tell me about the memory ritual, she said. The one you wouldn't recommend. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat, not across the table but at the end of it, close enough that she could have reached him if she'd leaned, which she did not. The blood memory is not merely a marker, he said. It is a record. Every vain woman who has carried it has added to it her life, her choices, her understanding of what she was, and because my blood is part of the covenant, I have retained a corresponding record. He paused. The ritual allows the transfer of that record. I would show you what I have witnessed. You would show me what you carry. And the danger is? It is not a small thing to carry 300 years of accumulated memory. Your mind was built for one life. She absorbed this, but it can be survived. It has been survived, he said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it. She looked at her hands on the table. The cut from 3 days ago had completely healed, no scar, no mark, as though it had decided not to leave evidence of itself. Do it, she said. He was quiet. Then there are things in my record that are not pleasant. I'm not looking for pleasant, she said. I'm looking for the truth of what my blood is and why men have been trying to end it for 300 years. He nodded once. He reached into his coat and produced the silver seal. He had been carrying it, she realized, since the day she'd found it. He set it on the table between them. Give me your hand, he said. She placed her hand palm up on the table. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The look of a man attending very carefully to something that requires his whole self to manage correctly. Then he placed both his hands around hers, cool and precise, and said something in a language she did not know, and the seal began to glow. It was not like anything she had words for. It was not painful. It was not pleasant. It was the experience of becoming briefly larger than her own skull, of feeling the edges of herself dissolve at the margins and something immense pour in along the seam. 300 years of dark and cold and the occasional warmth of a face remembered with perfect fidelity. She saw Alara Vane. She felt the particular quality of Alara's courage, careful and private, not bold, a strength built entirely from endurance rather than defiance. She saw the daughters and granddaughters who had followed, each of them different, each of them the same at the core, each of them arriving at Valemoor's gates with nothing but blood and mead and the stubborn fact of their continued existence. She felt Valerian's loneliness. It was the largest thing in the record and the most carefully contained, vast and old, and absolutely without self-pity, which made it worse. 3 centuries of standing watch over a covenant he had made in a winter he no longer dreamed about, protecting strangers who carried a ghost of an exchange he had entered willingly and could not regret, could not release. She felt his grief. The memory broke, gently, and she was in the library again. and her hand was still in his, and she was crying. Quietly, without drama, the way one cries at the end of something important rather than the beginning of it. He released her hands immediately and stood. He turned away. "I'm sorry," she said. "You have no reason to apologize. I felt it," she said. "All of it. How long you've—" "That was not the part I intended to show you," he said. His voice was very controlled. She wiped her face and looked at his back and thought about 300 years of standing at a window, watching strangers' torches move through a forest, binding held. "The hunters," she said when she trusted her voice. "The original covenant upset a power structure, a coven that wanted the old agreements dissolved. They've been using mortal hunters as proxies for 3 centuries because they cannot come for me directly while the covenant holds." "Yes," he said to the window. "And the only way to end it is to end my line." "Yes. Or end the covenant." He turned. She met his eyes. "Which requires," she said carefully, "both parties to renounce it." He said nothing. "You've never renounced it," she said. The fire shifted. The shadows moved. "No," he said, "I have not." He'd been expecting the emissary for 2 days. Valerian heard the knock at the outer gate, not with his ears, but with the particular awareness of a lord of his age and station, a tightening in the ambient air of his domain, a pressure that resolved into a presence as distinctly identifiable as a signature. He knew who stood at the gate before he crossed the courtyard to open it. Saravane, coven adjudicator, 3 centuries his senior, and exactly as tiresome as the last time they had spoken, approximately 90 years ago, over a different matter concerning a different mortal. That encounter had ended with a verdict he had spent the subsequent decades quietly ignoring. He opened the gate. Saravane was a woman, or had been, once, with the particular quality of great age dressed in agelessness, tall and pale in the way that was not alabaster, but something older than color had language for. She wore the coven's mark at her throat. She looked at him with the weary authority of someone who had issued more judgments than the current century had years. "Lord Valerian," she said. "Adjudicator," he said. She did not look at the castle. She had seen it before. "You have a mortal." "I have a ward," he said, "under covenant protection. You know the terms of the Vane Agreement." "The Vane Agreement is 300 years old," Saravane said, with the serenity of someone making an argument they consider already won, and has been challenged formally twice in that time. "The coven's position?" "The coven's position," he said quietly, "is that they wish to end the old agreements because the old agreements limit their authority. Their position has not changed. Neither has my answer." Saravane looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the tree line was empty. The mortal hunters had withdrawn, presumably briefed on the change in management. This was a courtesy he did not trust. "You are called to formal judgment," she said, and her voice took on the cadence of official procedure, the way a sword takes on the cadence of being drawn. Under Coven law, Article 14, the harboring of a mortal under an unratified historical covenant in a time of active Coven conflict, constitutes a breach requiring either immediate release of the ward or formal testimony before. "I know the law," he said. "Then you know the judgment." He did. Surrender the girl. Renounce the covenant. Allow the coven's proxies to handle the situation through whatever means they found appropriate, or stand before the adjudicator and answer for the breach. He stepped aside from the gate and let Saravane enter. Third person limited. ISO day. She heard them from the upper corridor before she saw them. Valerian's voice, and a voice she did not know, and the particular quality of formal speech that made her think of the Coven law book she had been attempting to read since her first day here. She descended the stairs. The entrance hall. Valerian standing near the far wall with the stillness that meant he was exerting significant control. The other woman. Tall, pale, with eyes that did not look at Isolde with hostility or welcome, but with the administrative interest of someone appraising an object in dispute. "Miss Vane," the woman said, as though Isolde had been announced. Isolde stopped on the last stair. She looked at Valerian. His expression told her everything she needed to know about how this was going, badly and formally, and toward a conclusion she would not be pleased with. The adjudicator requires your presence in the hall, he said, with a careful emphasis that she understood to mean, say nothing. Do not move. Do not give them anything to use. She moved into the hall. She stood beside the newel post and put her hands at her sides and watched the woman named Sarah Vane explain, in the civilized language of institutional violence, that Isolde Vane was to be released from Valerian's protection, that the covenant under which she was held was not ratified under current coven law, that Valerian faced formal judgment unless the covenant is still active, Isolde said. Both of them looked at her. She should have been more afraid. She noticed the absence of appropriate fear and filed it away as something to think about later. When she was not standing in a vampire's entrance hall attempting to argue coven law with an adjudicator older than the printing press. Active covenanters, she said to Sarah Vane, because she had in fact been reading the coven law book, archaic orthography notwithstanding. Under Article 7 of the Foundation Charters, may not be unilaterally dissolved by coven authority while both original parties remain in voluntary agreement. I am a Vane. My presence here is voluntary. She paused. Lord Valerian has not renounced the covenant. Both parties are in agreement. You have no legal grounds for judgment. The silence was considerable. Sarah Vane looked at Valerian. Valerian was looking at Isolde. The law, Sarah Vane said finally, requires blood acknowledgment to ratify a mortal's voluntary standing. Then we will perform the acknowledgment, Isolde said. She heard Valerian make a sound, not a word, barely a breath, but the sound of a man being confronted with something he had not expected and did not know, quite, how to hold. She looked at him, she held his gaze, and she kept her chin up, and she waited. The acknowledgment ritual was not what she had expected. She had expected formality. There was formality. Sarah Vane standing witness at the edge of the hall, her expression rearranged into the professional neutrality of someone performing a function they disapprove of, but cannot legally obstruct. There was the library table cleared, the silver seal brought out again, candles lit, and a formation she did not know the significance of. But she had not expected Valerian's care. He moved through the preparation of the ritual with the precision of great experience and the slowness of someone making a series of deliberate choices informed not by the ritual's requirements, but by some internal reckoning she was not privy to, some accounting he was running against his own old ledgers. When the candles were lit, he stood across the table from her. You understand what this is, he said. Not a question. The blood acknowledgement makes my voluntary standing legally binding under coven law, she said. It registers me as a party to the covenant. Sarah Vane cannot dissolve it unilaterally. She paused. I read the book. You read the book, he repeated, and something in his voice was not quite amusement. Quieter than that. More private. You have to understand, he said carefully, that this is not without cost. The acknowledgement is not merely legal registration, the blood exchange. It binds something. Not you, not your will, not your choices, but something. She thought about the memory she had felt through the ritual. 300 years of careful watching, of standing between strangers and the dark, of a loneliness so vast it had become indistinguishable from the air of the castle itself. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he drew, from somewhere in his coat, a small blade, not silver, something older than silver, and set it on the table between them. Your hand, he said, and then mine. The cut was small. She did not flinch. He cut his own palm in the same place, the same size, and for a moment his blood on the blade caught the candlelight and she saw it was darker than she expected, almost black, and then he pressed his palm to hers. The sensation was nothing like the memory ritual. It was not a flooding. It was more like recognition, like walking into a room you have described to someone many times and finally seeing it from the inside. There was warmth where their palms met which she had not expected from him, and there was, beneath the warmth, carried in it, a current of something she had no word for. Not ownership, not possession, something older and less legible, the particular quality of mattering to something that had learned to expect to matter to nothing. She felt him feel her, not her body, not her thoughts, something underneath those, the quality of herself. The specific configuration of her endurance and her grief, and her 3 days of running through a forest and her whole life of being quietly, persistently afraid of something she didn't have a name for. She felt him receive this, and she felt she could not have said how, that it was not unwelcome. He released her hand. The candles burned steadily. Saravane, across the room, was writing something, records, presumably, the official notation that the covenant was now formally acknowledged, that no coven authority could challenge it without facing the full weight of foundational law. Isolde looked at her poem. No mark. No visible evidence. She looked at Valerian. He was looking at the seal on the table, but his expression had changed. Something in it had softened, fractionally, in the way of a thing that has been held under pressure for a long time and has been, momentarily, allowed to rest. She will require a transcript, Saravane said, setting down her pen. Her voice was dry and impersonal. 3 copies, the coven's registry, the castle's records, and the ward's own keeping. She looked at Isolde. Congratulations, Miss Vane. You have successfully complicated approximately 40 years of coven policy. Thank you, Isolde said. Saravane looked at her for a moment, and then, very briefly, something that might have been approval moved across her face and was gone. She left without ceremony. When the castle door had closed, Isolde and Valerian were alone in the library, with the candles burning down and the fire, and the accumulated silence of a very old building that had just witnessed something it had not witnessed before. She sat down. Her legs were shaking slightly, which she had not allowed herself to notice while Saravane was present. Valerian was still standing. He was looking at her. You could have warned me, he said, that you intended to speak. You told me not to say anything, she said. Yes, he said. I did. A silence. Is it always like that? She asked. The acknowledgment. The feeling. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Not always. She looked at the fire. She thought about what she had felt, that current of mattering carrying in both directions, and the way it had settled, and the fact that it had not left. I felt how alone you are, she said quietly, in the blood. I felt it. He said nothing. I'm sorry, she said. Please stop apologizing for perceiving the truth. She looked at him. He looked at the window. Outside, somewhere in the dark, the world went on without them both. She asked him, the next morning, over the cold bread and the early gray of the library windows, whether he had ever wanted it to end. He understood what she was asking. He did not deflect it. The covenant, he said, or the watching, both. He turned the question over with the deliberateness of someone who has carried it for a long time and has never had an occasion to set it on a table where another person could look at it with him. There were years, he said, when I would have ended it, not with malice, simply from weariness. The weight of obligation is not always distinct from the thing it obligates. She nodded. She understood this in the smaller scale of her own life, the weight of being a vain woman, alone in a series of rooms that were never quite right, with a bloodline that attracted danger she hadn't earned. But you didn't, she said. No. Why not? He looked at his hands. They were very still, the way his face was often still. Not from emptiness, but from the deliberate containment of a great deal of movement that had simply learned, a long time ago, not to express itself. Because the alternative, he said, was that the line ended, that each of these women, Alara and the others who came after, would have faced what they faced alone, without the ward, without the grounds. He stopped. I am not capable of that. Even if they never knew you? Especially then. She sat with this. Outside, the grounds were quiet. The hunter encampment at the tree line had been reduced. 2 men, possibly 3, maintaining a presence more from institutional obligation than operational hope. The hunters won't leave, she said. Not now, not with the acknowledgment on record. They know the coven can't help them. That means they'll escalate. Yes, he said. What does that look like? He was quiet for a moment. The organization has, at various points in its history, employed assistants of a non-mortal variety. individuals willing to act against old covenanters for a consideration. She processed this. There are vampires who would work with vampire hunters. There are vampires, he said carefully, who have reasons of their own for wishing the old covenants dissolved, who would not work with the hunters precisely, but whose interests in this matter align. And you think they've made that arrangement? I think they have had 9 days to make it, and they are a patient and institutional organization. He looked at her, which means the next approach will not come from the tree line. She set down her bread. She thought about the lower levels she had not been permitted to explore. The deep cellars, the older foundations, the parts of the castle built before the upper floors were even planned. There are ways in, she said. Older ones. Before the ward was set, he looked at her with the particular sharpness of someone attending to a thought they had not yet had. He was rarely surprised. He had been surprised by her more than once. The South Foundation, he said. There is a passage that predates the ward, she finished. Yes, I found the door 3 days ago. I didn't open it. Why not? She looked at him. Because I was waiting to ask you about it. The silence between them had a different quality than it had had 9 days ago, not the silence of two strangers in an enclosed space managing their mutual incomprehension, but the silence of two people who have been through enough together to have developed a language that doesn't require words for most of it. You've been here for 9 days, he said. Yes, and you intend to remain. It was not quite a question. She looked at the window. She thought about the life she had had before, the series of almost right rooms, the watching over her shoulder, the hunters who had always been there at the periphery of her awareness like a sound she couldn't quite identify. She thought about the women in the portrait, about Alara Vane in her garden 300 years ago, about what it meant to carry a memory older than yourself, and to have no one to share it with. She thought about the acknowledgment ritual, and the warmth, and the current of something she had no word for. I don't know what I am, she said. What I will become. I know that the acknowledgement binds something, and I know I don't yet understand what that means for my... She paused. For my future. No, he said. I would not expect you to, yet. But I'm not leaving, she said. Not while the hunters are there. Not while... She stopped. Not while what? He asked, very quietly. She looked at him. He looked back, and the weight of 3 centuries was there in his eyes. And also, beneath that weight, carried in it, the particular quality of a man who has learned not to want things and is, slowly, unlearning that lesson. Not while there are things I don't yet know, she said. He nodded, very slowly. There is something else you should know, he said. His voice was careful. I received word this morning, a private source. The hunters have made their arrangement. He paused. They have until tomorrow night. They came through the South Passage at midnight. She had known they would. She had spent the afternoon helping Valerian lay protections along the interior of the passage. Not the grand wards of the outer grounds, which were ancient and structural, but smaller, more temporary workings, the kind that required her blood and his instruction and a patience she was not sure she possessed. She had cut her palm a second time willingly, and run her hand along the cold stone of the passage wall, while Valerian murmured something in that old language she was slowly beginning to recognize even without understanding, and she had felt the wall take the working the way. Dry ground takes water. Thirstily, completely, without remainder. Will it hold? She had asked. It will slow them, he had said. Not a lie. She had understood. The plan did not require the passage protections to hold indefinitely. It required them to hold long enough for her to reach the old seal chamber in the castle's deepest substructure, where the original covenant binding had been laid, where, Valerian had explained with the careful precision of someone managing their own dread, the ward's route was anchored. The covenant's protections ran from that anchor. If it was threatened, disrupted, the ward would weaken. But if it was reinforced, fed with a renewal of the original blood exchange, it would strengthen, would hold not just the grounds but the deeper passages as well, would seal everything. The cost was her blood, specifically the full resonance of the memory she carried, released into the anchor. permanently. She would not lose herself. She would not lose her memories or her sense of who she was, but the specific quality of the bloodline marker, the inheritance she had been carrying unknowingly for 22 years, would be given over. Spent, the record she carried would become the ward itself. She had agreed without deliberating long enough for second thoughts to find purchase. Valerian had not argued. He had looked at her with that specific expression, careful, deep, attending. And then he had nodded once and said, "I'll go through the South Passage. You go to the anchor." A pause, Isolde. Her name for the first time, not a title, not a formality. "Do not wait for me." She had not promised. She was in the anchor chamber when she heard the fighting. The chamber was not large. Stone walls. Old beyond her ability to estimate, with the anchor itself at the center. A disk of obsidian in the floor inscribed with the same crest she had seen on the seal, the antlers above the 3 stars, worn smooth by centuries but legible still. She knelt beside it, the silver seal in her hands, and listened to the sounds from the passage above. Not frightening sounds, not dramatic sounds, but the particular quietness of lethal efficiency, which she had come to understand was what Valerian's combat looked like. She pressed her cut palm to the obsidian. The memory came up immediately. All of it, 300 years of it. Alara and the daughters and the granddaughters and her own 22 years added at the end. The whole accumulated record of what her bloodline was, and what it had endured, and why it had always survived. She felt it begin to pull. She let it go. The ward took it. She felt the castle breathe, all of it at once. The stone and the foundations and the passages and the grounds, one great slow exhalation and then a settling deep and complete. And the sounds from the passage above went quiet. She stayed kneeling on the stone for a long time. She was aware that something was different. Not wrong, not damaged, simply different, the way a room is different when the thing that had been its defining feature is no longer there. She felt lighter than she should have. She felt not hollow. Nothing so dramatic as that. Simply finished, in the way of a task completed. Simply herself, without the inheritance she had always carried without knowing she was carrying it. She heard footsteps on the passage stairs. She turned. Valerian was standing in the chamber doorway. His coat was torn at the shoulder. There was blood, not his own, she did not think, on his hands. He looked at her kneeling beside the obsidian disc, and something happened to his expression that she had not seen before, and would not have adequate words for later. A kind of unraveling, very brief, of everything he had spent 3 centuries making sure stayed composed. He crossed the chamber in 4 steps and knelt beside her and took her face in both hands, very carefully, and looked at her with an intensity that had nothing of the administrator in it, nothing of the Lord, nothing of 300 years of careful containment. "You didn't wait," he said. "You said not to," she said. "I said." He stopped. His hands were still. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her for another moment. Then he sat back on his heels and closed his eyes. Briefly, the way she had seen him do in the library when the memory had first struck, the deliberate recollection of himself. She reached up and placed her hand gently over his. He opened his eyes. "It's done," she said. The ward held. "Yes," he said. He turned his hand under hers and held it. "The passage is sealed. The hunters." He paused. "They will not return." She nodded. They stayed there, in the cold anchor chamber, the ward newly settled in the stone around them, her hand in his for a long time. "I can't feel it anymore," she said. "The bloodline inheritance, whatever it was I carried." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said. "It was never mine to keep. It was always supposed to be." She looked at the obsidian disc. "Spent on something." "Eventually." He was very quiet. "Valerian," she said. He looked at her. "You should have told me what I was from the beginning," she said, and kept her voice even because she was angry, and she was also not angry, and both things were true at once. "All of it." "Yes," he said. "I should have. You have a habit of that." "Yes," he said. "And this time, There was the edge of something self-aware in it, something that knew it was a failing and had not yet worked out how to correct it. She looked at him. "We'll work on it," she said. He had not thought about what came after. This, Valerian supposed, was the particular failure of 3 centuries of obligation, that he had become so accustomed to the shape of the covenant, to the rhythm of watching and waiting and protecting, that he had not troubled himself to imagine the shape of its conclusion. The hunters were routed. The passage was sealed. Sarah Vane's transcript sat in 3 copies, one of them in a locked drawer of the library desk, unassailable under foundational law. The ward was stronger than it had been since the year Alara Vane had first stood in his entrance hall and looked at him with that expression. Equal parts terror and refusal to surrender to the terror. That was, he understood now simply what the Vane women looked like. What came after was Isolde sitting at the library table reading Coven law, and occasionally, with great concentration, writing notes in a small book she had found somewhere in the castle's upper rooms. He watched her do this, from the doorway, for approximately 6 minutes before she said, without looking up, "You can come in. You don't have to observe from there." He came in. He sat across from her, not at the far end of the table, not at the careful distance of their first days, but across where he could see her face. "The seal," she said, still writing. "It should be registered with the Coven's Foundational Records Office. Sarah Vane will delay if she can." "Sarah Vane will delay," he agreed. "I have other channels." "Good." She looked up. "The South Passage needs permanent sealing. Stone, not warding. Wards fail. Stone is harder to explain away to a work crew who doesn't know what they're sealing." "Also true," he said. She looked at him. The morning light from the window was on her face, and in it she looked very young, and also, somehow, ageless. Not in the way he was ageless, not the stillness of time refusing to pass, but in the way of someone who has been through enough to carry themselves with a weight that age would eventually catch up to. "I'm not going to leave," she said. He looked at her. "I want to be clear about that," she said, "because I think you're waiting for me to. I think you're preparing yourself for it, and I want you to stop." He was quiet. "I don't know what I am to you," she said. "I don't know what the acknowledgment means. Precisely, I know the legal architecture, I've read the law, but She gestured slightly at the space between them. "The rest of it, I don't know." "No," he said. "I don't know how to name it either." She nodded, as though this was the answer she'd expected. "Then we will learn to name it," she said. "Eventually, together." He thought about 300 years of standing at windows. He thought about Alara Vane's face in a garden that no longer existed, and the careful, private courage he had seen in every woman after her, and the particular quality of Isolde's courage, which was not the same as theirs, more argumentative, less patient with ambiguity, inclined to read the law before accepting that she had no recourse under it. He thought about her hand placed gently over his in the anchor chamber. He thought about the way she had said, "We'll work on it," without ultimatum, without a full accounting of what it was, simply the statement, as a fact, that the working would be shared. "You will age," he said, "and I will not." He said it not as a warning, but as the simple, unglamoured truth of the thing. "I know," she said. Eventually, "I know," she said again, and looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to solve that. I'm not asking anything. I'm telling you, I'm not leaving." He looked at her for a long time. He looked at the light on her face and the ink on her fingers and the small book in which she was writing notes about Coven law as though this were a problem she intended to solve by research. And he felt, under the vast familiar weight of the centuries, under the old and careful machinery of his composure, something give. Not break, not collapse. Simply give, the way a knot gives when the right pressure is applied to the right place. Slowly, completely, without damage. He reached across the table. He placed his hand over hers. She looked down at their hands, and then up at him, and she said nothing. Because she had said what needed saying, and he had heard it, and whatever came after. The slow mortal years, the weight of what she had given to the ward. The long and complicated education of two people learning to live in the same castle across the lengths of different lifetimes was not a story for today. Today she was here. Today the ward held. Today the hunters were gone and the law was on their side, and the castle, old as it was, had settled into the particular stillness of a building that has decided its long waiting is finished. He did not say, "You are mine." The claiming was not in the words. It was in his hand over hers, and in the way he did not remove it, and in the way she turned her palm up and held him back. 300 years of standing at a window, and then an ending to the standing, and the beginning of something that had no entry in his law books, no precedent in his careful records, no name in any of the languages he had learned across the length of his long, long life. He thought he might learn its name in time. He thought for the first time in 300 years that he had the time